Welcome to the Catholic Commission for Social Justice and the Archdiocese Ministry for Migrants and Refugees. Another episode of Climate Change is a Human Rights Issue. And today is a very special day because we are closing off the end of our season of creation where we actually felt compelled to introduce and launch this topic of discussion. But we are not finishing the series because we're going to talk about the environment as a human rights issue all the way until COP26 in November. So once again, thank you. And I have some good old favorites and faithfuls on our show today. We have the wonderful Marcia Tinto, who is representing the TNT chapter of the Laudato Si movement right here within our region, the Caribbean region. And we also have the wonderful Mr. Angelo Kurbanali of the Catholic Youth Commission. So both of you welcome. And I actually asked very specifically both of you here today because today is the feast day of St. Francis of Assisi, 4th of October. And both of you have a really great depth of understanding on theology and the importance of St. Francis of Assisi, not only to the season of creation, but also why his enduring spirit and message still are so pertinent today within our society as we tackle this issue of climate change. So I'm really excited to get this conversation going. And I'm going to start with Marcia. So Marcia, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're most welcome. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to set the context with a little historical background, not too much, about both St. Francis and Pope Francis. As everyone knows, St. Francis is the patron saint along with Saint Catherine of Siena of Italy, and he was born in a well-to-do family. He was a friar, he was a preacher, he was also a mystic. And he decided it was important to follow the ways of Jesus with simplicity, humility, being concerned about the poor, those who are displaced, those who are exploited, and later went on to do so much that we all know about. He's also the patron saint of animals and the environment. So very important to me and has always been. And Pope Francis now was born in Argentina, of humble beginnings. His father worked for the railway, I believe, and he was born Jorge Mario Bergoglio. And he first started off, and many people may not know that he used to be a bouncer at a club. He was a janitor, and then he studied chemistry. So his civil profession is chemistry. As many people say, what is he doing writing about environmental issues and environmental management? He's a pope, he's a theologian. No, but his civil profession is that of a chemist. He did his master's in chemistry. So I just wanted to set the scene. And when he was Archbishop, he was appointed Archbishop of Buenos Aires in 1998. He had quite a number of different views, I wouldn't say confrontations, but he always, as you know, he speaks up and he's very clear, he doesn't mince words about the inequality that was going on in Argentina at the time. And the humility started, although he joined the Jesuits, the humility continued. Not that I'm saying the Jesuits are not humble, but the humility continued because he refused to live in the Grand Archbishop's house in Buenos Aires. He opted to have an apartment, just a simple flat. And then in 2001, Pope John Paul II appointed him as a cardinal. And then we know the rest from there. And even now, he would not live in the Vatican's palace, so to speak. He has quarters elsewhere. And, he kept his cross, his silver bishop's cross. He doesn't like the austere or anything. And of course, following St. Francis's way of humility, of concern for the poor, for the vulnerable, refugees, and really a transformation, rebuilding the church, a transformation of the way we look at what the Catholic Church is like, to be more hands-on, because of course, understanding his history, he was hands-on no pun intended of him being a bouncer, but he was very hands-on on the ground with people. It wasn't just about theology. So I think that's something that we have to bear in mind, and hence the reason why he decided to write this encyclical in 2018. And he talks about many different things that are all very important for the survival or the sustainability of our world.
You know, Marcia, I'm glad you mentioned that point of being hands-on, because this encyclical came into being when Francis himself was Pope Francis himself, I should say, was on a world tour and saw the devastation that climate change had brought about, and the inequity within society, and how the most vulnerable struggle to deal with the fallouts, economic, and also loss of homes, loss of lives, loss of any sort of structure and stability within their lives. So I'm really glad you started with that point, because at the end of the day, this is now a situation where we as small island states will feel the brunt of climate change the most. And coming back to that message of being action oriented, Laudato Si as an encyclical it has some very strong language. And can we actually start with a direct quote? The earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. And that's some very damning language, one could say, which should inspire action in this time. So I actually want to bring Angelo into the conversation at this point, because Angelo, thank you for joining us. You are the voice of the youth. And one thing that certainly St. Francis of Assisi and Pope Francis call us to do is to be stewards of the creation. We are simply holding and protecting this earth, which we will then hand over to future generations that will go before us. But what are we handing them if Pope Francis is really describing the earth as an immense pile of filth? What are your opinions?
Hi, good afternoon, and thanks for having me, Dominic, and hi, Marcia. You're right, it is very strong language, that it is becoming a pile of filth, especially because we as Christians, and Catholic Christians especially, we see creation as grace, we see God's spirit in all of this. So for someone like Pope Francis, who I think, he doesn't choose his words loosely, he uses very intentional language. For him to be able to say things like that, I think is ultimately him putting the onus on us as human beings, that we are essentially extracting God's spirit from creation, and this because we are destroying creation in the process. We're killing creation, we're killing God, basically, right? And while we might be the cause for, making creation started like a pile of filth, we also have the power to be able to at least at this point mitigate things, because we have, according to some reports, gotten past certain points of no return, but I guess it's not completely doomed just yet, although we do seem like we're very close to that at this point.
And I'm glad you've actually raised that point. Let us mitigate with hope, because that also seems to be the call from Pope Francis. There is still hope. There is still time. So within our own context, right here in Trinidad and Tobago, last week we had hail in the middle of a heat wave, and this is not a doomsday prediction. There's a scientific process that can explain why that has indeed happened. But to quote St. Francis, Pope Francis himself, and I apologize for intermixing the two during this discussion, because we all know that eventually Pope Francis will probably become St. Francis also.
Definitely.
But, yes, for sure. But Marcia, I want to go across to you here. What should we expect within TNT with these doomsday predictions, with these extreme weather patterns? What is this? How should we be looking at this from a local perspective, but also an environmentalist perspective?
The thing is, with respect to climate change, we are a small island developing state, since as the acronym goes. So we're most vulnerable. Like many of the other countries in the Caribbean region, as well as the Pacific Islands, are also very vulnerable to the effects of climate change. There's been a lot of work, I think I mentioned this in my last interview, going on, but it's not promoted as it ought to be. So people are aware of what climate change is, but again, we have to make that shift. And the only way we can shift is through action. And I think Laudato Si movement, a movement is really action oriented, a group of people coming together to change the minds because they all have a common interest in changing the mindset. And I think that's a major problem in Trinidad and Tobago. It's not access to information because there is more than enough access to information that people can get their hands on. It's not lack of understanding. Well, for some there is, and I'm being general here. But it is really change. Because Pope Francis, I'm doing the same thing like you. He talked about change. He talked in chapter 18 of Laudato Si about change is important. Change is good. That's life. But once change becomes adverse and starts impacting people negatively, then we have to be cognizant about that and do something about it. So education, outreach, empowerment, I think those things are important because a teacher can sit, for example, in a classroom and educate. It doesn't mean it's going in. It doesn't mean the student is retaining. And that's why I think about hands-on. I speak a lot about hands-on, and I think that's the focus that St. Francis wants us, Pope Francis and St. Francis as well, because I think that's what he wants as well. Two of the same, I'm sorry. They want, so I've got to point out where they want us to act, to encourage people to understand. And, I'm going back to Genesis. The reading yesterday, the first reading was from Genesis 2. And it talked about the man, Adam, who was lonely. God saw he was lonely. And what did he do? He created the wild animals and the birds. And then he realized he was still lonely. So, of course, he put him in a deep sleep and took out a rib. And so the story goes about Eve. So he had his companion. But what did God try to do first? He tried to give him an environment. He tried to give him companionship through nature, and that is the disconnect that we have. We'll read about those things, but we and creation are one. We are part of creation. We are part of creation. It's not like creation is out there and we are separate and we use those resources indiscriminately without thinking about what's going to happen for the future generation.
I think that is such a fabulous point that you've just made there. We and creation are one. And I love that you referred right back to yesterday's reading and Genesis. And Pope Francis reiterates that when he says we need to love the earth as a sister that was created alongside us. And I think what really comes out with making those kind of correlations and those points, you're right, we need to shift our perspective because nature was created alongside with just as many rights as we do. And once again, I want to throw this one to Angelo too, because from the youth perspective, Angelo, the reality is the world that your generation and those that follow you that the world that you're inheriting is vastly different from the world that I thought that I was inheriting, and certainly the world that Marcia thought that she inherited. So what are the feelings like, and how can we all act? And Marcia, I'm going to come to you with this question in a little bit, because you're right, we need to now have a focus on action rather than the theological hands-off sort of approach to things. But how are the youth acting and what do they think about these things?
Well, I think I will start first with how we feel. And there's not a lot of optimism, because we did grow up, in school here and constantly, how much, bad things happening to the environment. We could see before our eyes the glaciers melting. We could see right here in Trinidad, we see and how many people are suffering because of the rains and because of the heat. Oh, well, even last week here, right? But, we see the very real effects of climate change taking place right before our eyes, right? And in terms of action, I mean, okay, yes, we all have our individual, actions that we could take, to reduce, reuse, recycle, to, reduce the amount of water and electricity consumption. We have all these things. But I do think that we also believe in a very collective sort of action. So I think today today being the feast day of St. Francis, right? As much as we praise St. Francis for, doing all the great work that he did, he never did it alone, He did it in part of community, with his fellow Franciscans, even Dominicans too, St. Francis and St. Dominic were like this. And then St. Francis also had like a female best friend, St. Clare, besides many unnamed followers and friends as well, and I do think for us as youth, we understand that, okay, we could start with these individual actions, but we also need to work together and to bring some Christian language into it, that we all are part of one body of Christ, right? To be able to work together. So as much as we could do individual, we need to do collective actions. And on top of that, we also feel, I think, let down by a lot of leaders and governments. Because we always say, okay, X, Y, Z needs to be done. And we need to do A, B, and C to do it. But we never see any action taking place. We might see the bare minimum. We might get like some lip service. But ultimately what we see is rampant greed and, this sort of unrestrained capitalism taking over. It seems like nobody cares ultimately, So while, yes, we could do our parts, like we could do in our individual parts, we need to work together, but we also need the help. But we need everyone's help. We need help of the governments. We need policymakers. We need, everybody has a role to play. Any profession or even non-professions, every single person has a role to play in order to help us, move forward through this. Because unless we're all on board, we're all going to suffer.
And I think that's exactly what Pope Francis says when he says, we're not going to get through these crises by hunkering down in individualism. As you've perfectly brought up that word of community, again, nice reference back to St. Francis of Assisi. And he was, or you're right, a part of a community. And we have to come together in a community of love for the collective, for humanity, for our earth, and just forging one spirit and one plan. And I love that, through Christ and under Christ. But you know what, and this is to segue a little bit, but what always strikes me about St. Francis of Assisi, and what I deeply admire, and I don't think I've been able to replicate it, is this concept of joy. He would burst into spontaneous joy and love at the sight of creation. And I found that, and in this world today where joy doesn't seem like it's very close, it seems far away and something that is elusive, the thought that we actually might be able to access that at any given moment by stepping into nature is a powerful thing, and certainly something that we want to promote to our wider society, that only nature with its awesomeness and to highlight Laudato Si again, nature is usually seen as a system which can be studied, understood, and controlled, whereas creation can only be understood as a gift from the outstretched hand of Father of all, and as a reality illuminated by a love which calls us together into universal communion. And it's through, again, this idea of community and universal communion that we will access those high-level emotions that we as humans are supposed to do on a daily basis. And from a theological perspective, I've always found that very curious. You know, I want to, I'm interested in the feedback from both of you. You know, have you experienced joy when you step into nature? And surely that's how we're all going to heal, when we truly appreciate nature from that perspective. So Marcia, I'd like to start with you.
Well, definitely. And you never hear of anyone being miserable after coming from the beach or hike in the forest. You always come rejuvenated. You return rejuvenated and happy, as tedious as it might be on a hike, for example. So although there is no cognizance, or there may be no cognizance of the relationship with nature and the bond that we have, it it brings joy. It definitely brings joy. People who are into gardening and their plants. I mean, oh, look at my flowers I'm doing. Look at my so-and-so plant, how it's growing, without realizing that that is joy through creation. So I think this is the way, this is the focus we have to adopt, to let people see in their everyday lives how they relate to creation. And of course, what Pope Francis calls integral ecology, which is not just about nature, but also the social and the human part of the whole. Well, basically, he's talking about sustainable development, which is considering the needs of people. So
the whole person.
Development is sustainable.
Yeah, and you know, again, to support what you're saying there, it's the integral human development is looking at the human with regards to mind, body, spirit, is also, but beyond that, how we best integrate within the commune, the community. Yes, and that's exactly it. And community meaning also the natural world and the flora and fauna, plants, animals, however you want to phrase it. But that's exactly it, you know, and we now need to see ourselves as part of something bigger, part of the earth, as our mother and our sister. So, Angelo, to kind of bring you back into the conversation a little bit here, you know, and to kind of support what Marcia was also just saying, that people love their gardens, people love and I've noticed with younger people too, that seems to be very trendy. Younger people really like to go out into nature, you know, hike, do those sorts of things, but also keep plants. What have you been observing there?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I became one of those, COVID hobby gardeners as well. And yeah, there is a joy that I would feel from being out in my garden with my plants. Sometimes it's as simple as a flower like this, right? But I think being out in nature too, like, for example, the beach or along a walk, I don't know if I would describe it as like euphoria. Let's say like, oh, I'm so happy to be here. But I think deep down there's this sort of unspoken peace and yeah, joy. Because from the outside, what I do experience is, yes, a graced environment covered with litter. Plastic bottle on the side, styrofoam over here, whoever the case might be, right? I can't say, at least not in recent memory, I've ever been to a place that I did not notice there was some sort of litter or, other result of human desecration, right? So I think that looking at all of that and experiencing all of that, deep down there is this internal, I guess, part of our spirit that still wants to commune with nature. So I would call that the joy. But there's also this sort of heartbrokenness that takes place from seeing what we do to our like to nature as well, to our, what's the word I'm looking for? Sister and brother, essentially.
That's it. But I also kind of really, and this might be more of a question for Marcia here. There are two types of people. They always say there are two types of people in this world: those that do and those that don't. And I've noticed there are two types of people with regards to littering. There are people who litter, and they don't seem to have any, and there are those who do not litter. So how do we bring people back? How do we bring people to to this place where where they could recognize, no, let's not do those things.
That is something I always encounter. People who later would have lovely homes. And I remember several years ago talking about it through my work, my actual work. And I was told, so if I do all of that, there's going to be no job for the garbage collectors. And this person was serious. So I think it is about looking at our role, our responsibility, our individual personal responsibility, as opposed to saying, well, the government will take care of this, the cleaners will take care of this. Because you go, as you said, Angelo, going on a hiking trail, there's no trail in Trinidad and Tobago where you will not find some piece of garbage, a plastic bottle most oftentimes, because they will take their water, plastic bottles to drink. It pains me when I go to the supermarket sometimes and see people buying so much water. Now I know there's the safety issue as well. Now I have always, and I'm not saying that people must not buy water, but we have to think of adjusting our lives. So for example, I will use water from the tap and boil it and then put it in the fridge. I hardly, once in a blue moon, use, bottled water. So, but I'm not saying that people have to do that. But if you are using bottled water, there's a whole business of sorting and recycling. Okay, try to use packaging. You go to the supermarket, and just this weekend there was something I was trying to get, and this one looked okay, but then all the packaging, I said no way, because there was so much that you had to unwrap before you actually got the product. The one that was in the least packaged is the one that I took. So in our everyday lives, we have to think about what we're doing.
And I actually want to highlight that point, that thought process that you went to there, because that's something that people don't think about, but actually is a critic. But we need to now shift those mindsets.
Yeah.
Look to see how your products are packaged. Look to see how much plastic is being used and is unnecessary, a lot of the time. So, and also with regards to buying bottled water, sometimes it's a matter of being cost effective. And I understand that. And we may not all be in a situation where we can buy a water filtration system for our, but I love the idea of just boiling the water, letting it cool, putting it in a glass container, preferably, because again, if you put it in plastic, the plastic will leach. Yeah. And it's not healthy for you.
And that's what I'm much older than both of you, but that's what we did when I was growing up. You boil water and you put it in a glass jug in the fridge, or a couple jugs depending. And there
you're not that much older, because I remember doing that. So you're fine.
So when we did grocery shopping, we got boxes. There was no plastic bags. There was boxes, and people go to the market with their baskets, the market baskets. So it was not something that was thought about, it just happened. But as Angelo mentioned, the whole capitalism, consumerism, and I'm not here to talk about politics, but it is something that's there that we have to consider. For example, when you buy a product now, and I always boast about this ironing board that I have, that my mother purchased when I was 8 years old. And all I do is change the cover, right? But it was made in a obviously sturdy. Now, products are not made to last very long, because the importance is you must buy. Consumerism. So if you manufacture things that last a long time, people aren't going to buy, you're not going to make money. So, how we get to that point of, we have to start with the small things, because if we start to think about the global, and I wouldn't say, I'm not refuting what Pope Francis is writing in Laudato Si. I think what he's saying is the action has to start with us, and we have to then set the example. And by doing that, other people will understand. So again, in our churches and our parishes, encouraging our priests, even our lay ministers and so on, to fit the environment somewhere there in their homilies. You know, even those who are teaching First Communion and Confirmation class, bring it there so that even if the change doesn't happen immediately, there's some thought process going on there. You know, Father talked about that a couple months ago, you know, I wonder. And then, you know, we'll start doing it.
Yeah.
But it has to be integrated into our religious studies, into all aspects of our formation as Catholics.
I'm actually seeing it because I'm a parent and my daughter is 7. I have to think about it. Please excuse me. But I'm actually seeing it within her syllabus. They are putting those messages in. You know, again, to throw this on to you, Angelo, what's the focus for the Catholic Youth Commission in lobbying and rallying the youth around this issue? What are the messages moving forward?
Well, I think like we try to raise a lot of awareness as well. So while we try to do our own stuff here at the Office of Youth Ministry, we also try to inspire change and movement in the people to whom we minister as well. And who we minister to mainly are youth leaders. So us inspiring them and the youth leaders begin to inspire the people to whom they minister, you know, that there is to show how much there is this interconnectedness with everyone and everything. You know, we do what we can to try to inspire, and then let the inspired ones go on to inspire as well, you know. And I think one thing that we often don't talk about Laudato Si as much as we should is the way climate change affects, you know, the poor and the vulnerable. You know, how much climate change and, you know, the unfettered capitalism ultimately rise the backs of the poor. And I do think we need to bring a lot more, as much as Laudato Si is, you know, within the social teaching of the church. I think we need to push that a lot more because, yes, you know, small incremental changes are important and necessary, but we also don't feel like we have a lot of time. You know, we're in code red, according to that latest IPCC report, right? You know, and we're very, very well aware, too painfully aware of how code red we are, you know?
Yeah. And, you know, going back to this idea of consumerism, one of the things that really struck me is, especially with younger audiences, is these systems that we've all grown up in, and more so your generation than my generation, and less so your generation than my generation, Marcia, is how accessible and how much of a consumer focus we are operating in. We live in a world of fast fashion, of fast food, of fast everything, where we can just purchase. And there's a certain level of addiction that comes with that. And it's changing those sorts of systems and structures, you know, and with COVID, when we all shut down, when things had to close, and we didn't have that high level of consumerism. Now that we're opening back up, I think Pope Francis actually makes the call to all of us: don't go into, you know, that system again when we're just consuming. Even though it would be great to stimulate the economy, we do need to be balanced in our approach. We need to reuse, we need to reduce, we need to recycle, and we need to move away from systems that seem normal to us, but are actually very new. Because, Marcia, when you were a child, how often did you get a toy? Just out of curiosity.
I got books more often than toys. Toys came at Christmas time.
Well, this is exactly it. Kids get toys every other day. You know, it's the mass production. You know, it's the globalized economy that we you know, China has revolutionized, you know, as our world. And these are the systems that we need to now readdress because there's an imbalance. And I say this, and I always say this, we've run out of time just as the conversation was getting going. But I wanted to thank you both for coming on our program today. And again, I encourage the Catholic community and the wider community to read Laudato Si. So to close, I want to put you both on the spot. Usually I will send my list of questions and comments through beforehand. I want to ask each of you, what is your favorite part of Laudato Si? What is your favorite aspect of Laudato Si? And please communicate on this feast day of St. Francis of Assisi why everyone should read this encyclical. Why? So, Marcia, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I might be a little biased coming from the environmental field, because I got a copy of Laudato Si some time ago, maybe 2 years ago. Somebody said, oh, I got this and I thought you'll be interested. I said, okay, well, I'm a fan of Pope Francis and I'm into the environment, so yeah. And I'll tell you, my copy of Laudato Si stays on my bed with my other prayer books. And I would read from it randomly. Sometimes I would send paragraphs or quotes to friends. And for me, there's so much in it that I can't neglect. Everything is important. Nothing is more important than the other. But one of the things, well, because of my background in sustainable development, I tend to like chapter 25, the implications of looking at the environmental, social, and economic, which is really sustainable development. So the implication. So he doesn't use the word sustainable development because, of course, we don't want to turn people off with the jargon, but you really want them to zone in to see what it is about, that all these things have an impact on the other, because those are the three pillars of sustainable development, and one really can't exist without the other. So it's striking a balance among people, among people, the environment, and the economy. Because we need economic development, we need that to survive. But then the disparity between rich and poor is something as well that we really need to be mindful of. And not just mindful, we need to do something about it. I mean, even here in our own country, we've seen that disparity. Long ago when I saw Mercedes-Benz, I mean, and I'm not here to attack anyone who's riding a luxury car, but you say, oh, there's a Benz, and now, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And then you have people, because of my work, I go and I see the poorest of the poor. And I've mentioned in the last program, and I always talk about that there are children who go to school only because there's a free lunch. Yeah. And I knew of a child once having half the lunch and taking it the other half home to the little brother who was not at school and had no food. And I am worried right now with the school feeding as children at home. I know the constituency officers and so on are giving out hampers and so on, but I'm wondering how much food children are actually getting. What's really happening with all these people who have lost jobs. Donating is fine, but is it getting to the people or the right people at the time that they need it?
I fully agree with that, and exactly that. The disparity between the rich and the poor, and really who pays the price? It's always the vulnerable, it's always the innocent, it's always the children. And as you said, prior to COVID, a lot of kids went to school simply because of the school feeding program. And now they've been out of school for over a year. So we have the disparity in education. We have this, and again, as you've rightly said, job losses, the level of abuse we can only imagine in these homes. It's a scary thought. Yeah. It genuinely is. So thank you, Marcia. Angelo.
Well, to come up with the same point that what Marcia raised, I don't think there's, any theme is one more important than the other. But I do think this question kind of goes to show how much collective action is necessary, because, Marcia, like the environmental undertone resonates, it's not even undertone, but the environmental theme resonates with Marcia. And for me, you know, it kind of goes back ultimately to, you know, the poor, the vulnerable. So like one thing I would always say, it's a little bit controversial, but to be pro-life does not mean to be pro-birth, right? Pro-life is from conception to natural death. And as long as we continue to ride the backs of the poor, the marginalized, the vulnerable, we're not being pro-life. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I'm giving you a tap for that too.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
We need to take care of the, you know, the poor, the vulnerable, the marginalized first. You know, we need to have a preferential option for the poor. Until we make that, until we put out the forefront of everything we do, then we're not doing good enough. You know, so while I can't pinpoint like a chapter from Laudato Si, I will say the fact that, you know, Pope Francis ultimately shows us that, yes, you know, climate change is taking place and care for creation is, you know, of the utmost importance. Ultimately, we need to follow Christ's command, you know, and love one another the same way he loved us.
I thank you. And to sum up what you both have said, I'm going to quote from Laudato Si. We are not faced with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the underprivileged, and at the same time, protecting nature. We're dealing with one crisis right now. And the only way we're going to get through it is if we come together and we support all within our community, and our community being the earth, the human, and all living things. So thank you both for joining us today. It is St. Francis of
Very much
Assisi,
for having us on.
and I'm sure both of you are coming off to go and have a look at the budget to see how much no, but I want to see.
I usually do. I always do. Since I was a child, my grandmother and we'd sit and listen to the budget. Deceased Dr. Eric Williams read that budget for about 3 hours. But this year, I feel like I'll just, you know, read the takeaways from the budget after.
And go sit in nature.
Yeah.
Let's go do something that will genuinely give us joy.
I have work to do.
Oh, that's anyway, on behalf of the Catholic Commission for Social Justice, Marcia, thank you. Angelo, thank you. It was wonderful. And please tune in next week as we continue our discussion, climate change as a human rights issue. Thank you, everyone.
You're most welcome. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.